First of all, I hope she always interrupts me. She always interrupts me. Hold on. There we go. First of all, I hope you all had a happy Thanksgiving and are preparing to enjoy a wonderful and joyous holiday season as we start. Right now, we do not have any future programs scheduled for the month of December. However, there's always the chance something might pop up. I'm looking out to see whether any speakers are coming into town for Air University that we might get to join us. So stand by, but we will also be publishing a schedule for the spring shortly. We're working on that right now. And so we'll look forward to joining you again or by email and other means. In the meantime, you'll be able to get to anybody who wants to look at this again. We'll have this up. Anton was nice enough to record a podcast with me that goes into some of this, and we may have covered some things we won't cover tonight. That'll be coming out shortly, Speaking Globally, and I'll send an email out to the membership once that podcast is put up online. Well, I've been talking to many of you, and you've remarked this is a timely program, and yes, it is. With the events of October 7th and what has followed afterward, it's very important for us, those of us who are engaged on the world stage, to really try to understand these issues in depth. And we are indeed fortunate tonight to have Anton La Guardia, diplomatic editor of The Economist, joining us via Zoom from Washington, D.C. Now, prior to his current role, Anton was digital editor, deputy foreign editor, and Middle East and Africa editor. He's got a long and very full list of assignments and experience. How I first met Anton was through his book. He's the author of Holy Land, Unholy War, Israelis and Palestinians, an account of the Middle East conflict. Now, in America, you're going to find this as War Without End, Israelis, Palestinians, and the Struggle for a Promised Land. He's also the author with John Peet of Unhappy Union, How the Euro Crisis Can Be Fixed and the Euro Saved. He's a frequent broadcaster, both on radio and television. In fact, I was listening to NPR just a few days ago, and there was a familiar voice of Anton. It was great to hear his perspectives. He was formerly based in Brussels as European Union correspondent and author of the Charlemagne column. And then prior to this, he was defense and security correspondent. He joined The Economist in October 2006 after spending 2 decades at the Daily Telegraph, where he worked as diplomatic editor, Africa correspondent, Middle East correspondent, and Ireland correspondent. He started working as an international correspondent in 1986 when he covered the People Power Revolution in the Philippines as a freelance journalist. Indulge me and let me add a personal note. It's been an honor and a pleasure to get to know Anton. I met him when I was working for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force in the Pentagon in the early 2000s. Our paths crossed again in London and then later in Afghanistan, which shows you he's always around. And I'm glad that we were able to claim some of his time tonight to address the Alabama World Affairs Council. I've promised Anton he's interested in seeing Montgomery and coming to Alabama. He hasn't been before, so I've promised him we're going to bring him back in person. But I think you'll really enjoy what he's got to offer tonight. And let me preface this, as I know he will. He and I discussed this, and this is about Israelis and Palestinians, but he's going to put this in the context of American power and give you more of a global perspective before he dives down into that issue. With that, it's our pleasure to welcome via Zoom Anton La Guardia.
Thank you very much, Walter. I hope you can all hear me. Raise a hand if you can hear me, yeah? Okay. Can you hear me? No. Okay. So, okay, fine. Thank you. Yes. The answer is yes. So first of all, thank you for that hugely generous introduction. I certainly remember meeting Waldo for the first time, talking about airplanes and Air Force. And this was at the time when America was deeply committed in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And many people in foreign policy and in DoD hoped that those days of intense involvement in the Middle East were over, but they're sadly back with us with a vengeance. As General Givan said, I thought I would start at the sort of the other end of the telescope and look at American power writ large. And then maybe drill down into the Middle East, and also leave you to ask me questions about the Middle East. I should say I've not been back in this cycle of violence, but have been writing about it from a distance from here. And it comes at a time when the United States is deeply involved in helping Ukraine to fend off the invasion by Russia, and also at a time when the United States is extremely worried about the possibility of a crisis in the Indo-Pacific, especially over Taiwan. So there is a kind of real question about the stresses and strains that these multiple crises are placing on America's power, on its attention, on its ability to deal with things, and the extent to which these things are interconnected. And they're interconnected. One is through the supplemental that the administration submitted to help Ukraine, to help Israel, and to help Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific. But there are also internal connections among the foes that the US and its friends face. These sort of three autocratic powers, Iran, China, and Russia, that help each other, certainly in disseminating the narrative of American decline and Western sort of colonial mentality, but also in actually helping each other. So Iran is supplying drones to Russia, North Korea is supplying artillery to Russia, and China is skirting very close to the line and supporting Russia with dual-use items. So Austen Chamberlain, the half-brother of Neville Chamberlain, who is the more famous half-brother, but Austen is famous for having brought to life the phrase, the apocryphal Chinese dictum, may you live in interesting times. This was meant as this is sort of ostensibly a compliment that's a curse, but for us journalists, it's kind of a compliment and a journalistic blessing, because bad times of the world give us what to write about and to try and explain in the first draft of history, as people sometimes say. So we don't have the luxury of looking back. We have to write on the spot and try to give our best assessment of what's going on. So I've been in Washington for a couple of years now, but I've been writing about the world and America's role in it since I was a young freelance journalist and covering people power in the Philippines, when America whisked off Ferdinand Marcos from the presidential palace in Manila. And then I was back this year as his son, Bongbong Marcos, is enacting a rapprochement with the United States to confront China. And in between, I spent many years in the Middle East and other places, as Waldo has set out. It took Madeleine Albright to popularize the idea of America as the indispensable nation. But even though we didn't always have a word for it, we were covering aspects of America's indispensability, the nature of American power, how it exercised it. The pressing question on the day was often, what would America do about this problem or that crisis in the Balkans or Iran or Israel-Palestine, and so on. This is a different era, I think, because we're talking about the limits of American power, the restraints, the growing number of foes that it faces. So I thought I would take a brief excursion, if you'll indulge me, into the times I've written explicitly about American power. The first time was for The Economist in 2007, and I don't know if Jeremy is able to throw up the cover that we did at the time. This was 2007, at the time of the surge in Iraq, when American units were extremely stretched, and we had this cover, which was, it was asking the question about whether America was battered and bruised, but came to the conclusion that America was still number one, that it still had an unparalleled network of allies that it could call upon in order to deal with the challenges that it faced. The headline of my piece inside it was called "A Hobbled Hegemon." I wrote that certainly America faces stronger regional antagonists, but none is yet competing for global supremacy, whether alone or in concert. Well, times have changed in the past 15 years. Fast forward to 2021, when I just took up my job in Washington, and I went to Pearl Harbor for the 80th anniversary of Japan's attack on Hawaii. This was a moment when America had just withdrawn from Afghanistan. So the question was on people's minds, and this was, what would America fight for? And again, the boxing glove image comes back to the cover of The Economist. And the headline of my piece was "A Weary Superpower," and the assessment was growing gloomier. And I wrote that America's self-doubt, suspicion of globalization, hyper-partisan politics, and unpredictable policymaking prompt allies to question the reliability of American power. What is America prepared to fight for? Nevertheless, we had a kind of still somewhat rosy view that America and its lurches of policy remained attractive as an ally to many countries, especially as they tried to counterbalance Russia, China, and Iran. And our editorial at the time warned that if America pulls back, the world will become more dangerous. In the event, a few months later, when Russia invaded Ukraine, America did not pull back. It supported Ukraine to an unprecedented degree with arms, money, and intelligence, although no boots on the ground. Then came Hamas's attack on Israel, and we returned to the subject of America, and this time with a different cover. There were no boxing gloves. It was America's test of Joe Biden walking between missiles firing from all directions. And here, as I said, we were really talking about whether America could deal with the crisis in Ukraine, the new crisis in the Middle East, and a potential one over Taiwan. And my own piece at the time was entitled "The Overstretched Superpower." And the piece opens by marveling at the speed with which America could deploy force around the world. 2 aircraft carrier groups, strike groups deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean and then now to the Gulf. More air power, more air defenses, extraordinary display of power intended to deter Hezbollah, Iran, and other malevolent actors that might want to get involved in what was turning into a very nasty war between Israel and Hamas after Hamas's wanton murder of more than 1,000 people in Israel proper. And here we ask the question in the editorial. So in my piece, in which we say that America's acted nimbly in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, but the crisis in the Middle East was different because America was more alone in its defense of Israel, more liable to lose friends in the Arab world and the global South, and with fewer partners to help it. So where are we now? I think that Joe Biden is right when he talks about this being an inflection point, although the turn of phrase is ugly. Um, in his view, he rightly says that helping friends is not just possible, but necessary for America. Quotes, American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us and America safe. We as the Economist would wholeheartedly endorse that view, and much of what we've written has been intended to encourage America to remain globally engaged and for America's allies to do a lot more to help preserve the liberal world order that was built after the end of the Second World War. But America's power is much more contested, much more challenged. Joe Nye, the Harvard academic, defined national power in 3 dimensions that are still useful: military, economic, and soft power. And in military terms, America remains a colossus. It spends more than any other country, at least at market exchange rates, and more than its NATO allies put together. Economically, it's much more of a bipolar world than it was during the Cold War. China's economic output is somewhat smaller than America's at market exchange rates, but surpasses it at purchasing power parity, although Americans remain much richer than the Chinese. China's economic troubles now mean that people ask whether China has peaked, and there's an interesting debate among academics on whether peak China is less dangerous, makes China less willing to take risks, or more willing to take risks if it thinks its window of opportunity has passed. I'm inclined to think that China is liable to be more cautious, but we can debate that perhaps in the question and answer. And then the third dimension, soft power, is hard to measure, but I think we can probably argue that it's more of a multipolar world with multiple centers of influence and soft power. So what does this mean for Joe Biden's policy? He came wanting to revitalize the American economy. He wanted to revitalize alliances and have a more stable and predictable relationship with Russia and do less in the Middle East in order to focus on China. A lot of that agenda has gone awry. He's had to backpedal on a lot of the things he set out to do, although I think on the Indo-Pacific he has managed to keep focus and has done much to stitch together sort of ad hoc alliances that together don't add up to a new NATO, but I think collectively are quite interesting, at least complicate China's calculations. For instance, the greater presence in Australia, the AUKUS partnership, the Quad relationship with India, and the emerging new Quad with the Philippines, which is kind of where I started my journalistic career. But the kind of sense that it's not all going according to plan was unfortunately encapsulated by Jake Sullivan when he declared in late September, the Middle East region is quieter today than it's been for decades. And he welcomed the fact that he, as National Security Advisor, had to do a lot less in the Middle East than most of his predecessors since 2001. This raises the crisis in Israel and Palestine raises a number of questions. One is, will the conflict spread? The second is, will America's attention be diverted, which is what worries a lot of partners and allies? And will the crisis aggravate other ones in this kind of interplay? For example, will China see an opportunity to attempt either an invasion or some kind of gray zone operation against Taiwan? Will Russia feel emboldened to press hard in 2024? A lot of this comes down to America's reliability, and I think that that parses into 2 separate dimensions. One is credibility, and the other is capacity. The credibility argument has gone on for a long time among academics, which is that a failure to live up to obligations to one ally, does that affect commitments to others? And here the Afghanistan debate comes in, where you hear many people say it all goes wrong when America pulls out of Afghanistan. Not so, says Jake Sullivan. We're in a much better position now to deal with these big crises that now that we've got out of Afghanistan. People in the room will have a view on all this, but the point is the issue is there. I think the more interesting one to talk about is capacity. Sorry, I should say one thing about credibility, which is that the historical precedent of America's withdrawal from Vietnam, there was a lot of instability after the withdrawal from Vietnam, but in the end, America went on to win the Cold War. So the optimist here will say, a superpower can lose, can get out of one contingency, embarrassingly sometimes, but in the end can still prevail. On the capacity question, America is now supplying 3 allies with weapons, trying to make them to strengthen them either in their actual wars or potential wars. And this raises a question about the depth of America's arsenal and the capacity of its defense industries to meet the needs of allies as well as to replenish its own stockpile. Now, in a sense, the 3 allies involved here require different sorts of weapons, although there is overlap. For instance, over 155 millimeter artillery shells, which are in short supply everywhere. America has applied in large numbers to Ukraine, but is also supplying to Israel. And in general, America is ramping up production, but it's going to take a number of years to get up to 1 million odd shells a year. Russia is probably already producing that and may well go up beyond that, and is receiving anything from 300,000 to 500,000 shells from the North Koreans. So to the extent that modern warfare between states requires a huge amount of ammunition, then there are real questions to be asked about the defense industrial base and whether it needs to get onto, if not a war footing, then at least the ability to get onto a war footing. These problems can be solved with time and money. So the question is, how much time is there and how much money is there going to be? And I think this leads into a third factor, which is political polarization and paralysis in Congress. To an outsider like me, a European, the interlocking vetoes in the congressional process are bewildering. Congress, yes, has the power of the purse, but the balance of power in Congress seems to rest with America First radicals who may be a minority in Congress, may even be a minority of the Republican Party, but nevertheless appear to hold a whip hand. So there is no full year budget for fiscal year 24, despite the pleas of everybody in the Pentagon to say we need proper budgets, continuing resolutions, and the absence of fresh aid for Ukraine, and now for Israel and for Taiwan. There is a growing health shell hunger in Ukraine. The aid packages are becoming smaller and smaller as America tries to husband what few resources are left over an unpredictable period of time. And the longer this blockage goes on, the worse things get as America enters election fever leading up to November 2024. I've heard congressmen worry that if you don't get the supplemental package in this session before everybody breaks up for Christmas, then it'll be very hard to do in the new year and may get delayed until beyond November. And if Donald Trump is elected, all bets are off. Who knows what will happen? And in a sense, Joe Biden has tried to stitch together, because of the need to try and get the supplemental through, he stitched together these various crises into one, trying to say this is all about autocrats and terrorists trying to annihilate democracies. And he is right to an extent. At the same time, I think the war in Israel is different from the one in Ukraine in several respects. One is to do with international perceptions. Israel is a stronger party. It's not the underdog like Ukraine is. Israel is the country that's got nuclear weapons, whereas in Ukraine, Russia is the party that's got nuclear weapons. And there's this whole question of statelessness of Palestinians, who have been are stateless people. Because of those things, as for alliances, whereas the Western allies are very united in defense of Ukraine and can have a call on the global South and saying we're defending the UN Charter here, which all of you have an interest in, the allies are much more split on the question of Palestine and Israel, and the global South tends to be sympathetic with the Palestinian cause, if not Hamas itself. So Mr. Biden's embrace of Israel is sincerely felt. It's also an attempt to gain influence on how Israel wages its war, and you hear him placing many more conditions on what Israel does, how it conducts itself, warning it of America's own experience of 9/11 and its wars on terrorism. But there's a danger, of course, that it is going to be seen as a warring party, given the way it has embraced Israel's cause and insists that Israel has a right to defend itself and ultimately to destroy Hamas. He is right to ask the question, what happens the day after? And nobody has a really good answer. Israel has not really offered an answer. And the answer that Joe Biden asks, which is to return to the two-state solution, looks extremely difficult. A lot of things have to go right for that to succeed. There is a logic to the two-state solution. You have two peoples who believe the same piece of land belongs to them, are willing to fight for it, and are never willing to give it up. So, and you also have roughly similar sizes of populations, 7 million Jews that live between the geographical area of the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, and roughly 7 million Palestinians who live in a much more scattered fashion. Some of them are citizens of Israel, some of them are in the West Bank, and some of them are in Gaza. But ultimately, the deal that people talk about looks not very dissimilar from the one that people talked about in 1994 at the time of the Oslo agreements. A partition, a division of the land roughly along the border of 1967, demilitarization of the Palestinian state, a special status for Jerusalem, international guarantees, and all the rest of it. But there are two sets of problems. One is the spoilers, who have shown time and again that they're extremely powerful, both on the Palestinian radical side, the groups such as Hamas, and Islamic Jihad, and some bits of Fatah, the nationalist movement, and on the Israeli side, Jewish settlers, radical groups, the far right, some of whose members are now in the Israeli government. There's even talk in Israel of returning to settling the Gaza Strip, which Ariel Sharon abandoned because it was too difficult and too expensive and too costly in terms of blood and treasure. And the other thing that has happened since 1994 is the kind of catastrophic loss of trust of both sides as a result or as a consequence of the attempt to make peace along the two-state solution. Because of the actions of spoilers, as far as Israelis are concerned, terrorism has got worse. As far as Palestinians are concerned, the occupation has got worse. So why do we trust the other side to do that? And America has less power to impose such a solution on the others. Nevertheless, the alternatives to the reason two-state solution endures is that the alternatives seem so much worse. One is, the destruction of Israel, if you believe Hamas's charter. The other is the transfer of the Palestinian population out of the occupied territories by people who dream of it on the far right. This is something that worries the Jordanians and the Egyptians, terrifies them, the idea that Palestinian refugees will again be pushed beyond Israel's borders. Then you have the idea of, well, if you can't split it into two states, can you have a binational state, one state for two peoples? And I think a lot of Israelis would find that, it's attractive to a certain number of Palestinians. I think a lot of Israelis would find that difficult because it would mean losing the almost exclusively Jewish identity of the state of Israel. And the fourth option would be some kind of permanent occupation of keeping a large number of Palestinians under some kind of second-class citizenship, a kind of apartheid state, although I use the term advisedly, at least in the territories that Israel occupies or controls, such as the Gaza Strip, at least externally. So for the administration's view of, that the ultimate political horizon should be a two-state solution, an awful lot has to go right. One is that the power of Hamas has to be greatly reduced and not destroyed. The second thing is that the Arab states have to want to come in and pick up the pieces, and who really wants to clean up after Israel. I don't think the Europeans want to do it. I don't think the United States wants to do it. The Palestinian Authority, greatly weakened, greatly discredited, partly because it's failed to deliver Palestinian statehood, has to be able and willing and trusted to come back to Gaza, from which it was kicked out by Hamas, and take over. The Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu has to want to cooperate on a two-state solution, which it's done its utmost to prevent, or it will lose power, and you'd have a more centrist coalition willing to go down this road. But if you're an Israeli and you say, if Palestinian statehood looks like Gaza under Hamas, no thanks, I don't want it. Then America has to have the time and the energy and the inclination to bring it about. Remember that we're in an election year, so the ability to maneuver and take difficult decisions and actions will be greatly diminished. And the last thing is the world has to be willing to reconstruct Gaza, and it's unlikely to do that if it believes it's going to get bombed to smithereens again. So an awful lot of things have to go right. It seems to me that things are more likely to go wrong. And having tried to get out of the Middle East, Joe Biden's presidency may well be defined by it. I think I should stop there. I've talked for probably long enough. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to take questions, not least because I learn a lot from the questions that people ask me, and they force me to think harder. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you indeed, Anton, for diving in. And I know the questions will take us even further. So without further ado, we have a question in the room for Anton. Jeremy, over to you while we're gathering questions here.
Yes, I'm drawing a parallel to the Northern Irish conflict, which has been kind of happening lately. That the 1998 agreement in Northern Ireland, the Belfast Agreement, was simply the Sunningdale Agreement of 1974 for slow learners, which is how an Irish academic described it. So you seem to hint that it would be very difficult even to get a repeat of the Oslo agreements back into acceptance. The conflict has been repeating and going on for just as long, for decades, for a whole generation, even since the Intifada. So what's the more likely outcome than a new Oslo Accords type of agreement? What's the pessimistic solution, if there is one? What are we going to look at by the end of 2024?
Jeremy, the short answer, not to be trite, is it doesn't look good to me. Mm-hmm. I think we're probably going to go into more of what we've had before, which is what Israelis call mowing the lawn, periodic military campaigns that attempt to restore deterrence and may or may not hold for a certain amount of time before you get the next round of fighting. Now, the destruction this time around is a lot worse, and the Israelis say we're not going to do that again because it didn't work. But Hamas is not a sort of jihadist group of the kind that Al-Qaeda and ISIS were, who were a kind of distant vanguard movement that sought to provoke the rest of the Muslim world into action. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's an idea, it's a religious thought, it's a political movement, and it's a terrorist group, as well as being a militia. So I think they're quite hard to eradicate. I think short of permanent reoccupation of Gaza by the Israelis, which may be what it comes down to, they will always reemerge from the rubble and say, here we are. So I think it's quite difficult. You mentioned Northern Ireland, Jeremy, and it's interesting because I spent time in Northern Ireland as a young correspondent. I also spent time in South Africa. And there are some lessons from that. First of all, in Northern Ireland, unlike Israel and Palestine, sorry, the reason for mentioning all three, that these are all three sort of settler societies with a kind of religious idea of kind of enacting God's will. And in Northern Ireland, you had, despite the Troubles, a middle class that mixed. So, Catholics and Protestants mixed in South Belfast, and they spoke the same language. And there was a kind of external power, which is the British Army, that kept the level of violence down to a certain level and attempted to kind of keep the two sides from getting at each other's throats. In South Africa, it was a story of the minority giving up apartheid and trusting the majority under Nelson Mandela and the guarantees that a new constitution would bring to sort of give up power. It was sort of exhausted white minority. And the trick there was to have a Nelson Mandela figure who won the trust of the oppressor, if you want to put it in those terms. And so, the two ingredients that are lacking in Israel and Palestine are a middle class that mixes and know each other, which doesn't exist. Society is utterly divided in Israel, particularly among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. There is more mixing among Israeli Arabs. This is Palestinians who are citizens of Israel in Israel, but it's a very thin stratum. And there is no Nelson Mandela figure that's ever emerged from the Palestinian side that has said, we're giving up the gun and we're going to try and win over the trust by giving you lots of guarantees and by giving you a kind of border and saying, if you stop oppressing us, we will stop fighting you and coming to kill you. Hamas's attack on October the 7th was designed to inflict horror and basically tell Israelis is no matter what you do, we're going to keep coming after you. And it's very hard if you're even a moderate centrist Israeli to say, okay, fine, I'm going to stop.
Okay, in the audience here.
Anton, thank you very much for your comments. Wonder if you would just talk to the resistance by Egypt and other countries in the area of why they're not assisting the refugees or trying to help out in any way.
Because they're torn and because they're scared. First of all, they don't want to be seen to play a role in any further expulsion, dispossession of Palestinians. So they don't want to take in more Palestinian refugees as a matter of kind of historical justice, as they would see it. Second of all, they're worried that more Palestinian refugees will bring more instability. Sinai has been destabilized in recent times with the emergence of a jihadist movement that's been suppressed, which Egyptians see as having been caused by the Gaza Strip, by the instability in the Gaza Strip and Hamas and Islamist movements in Gaza. So kind of spillover from Gaza, not least because of the black market in traffic and weapons that goes on under the border. And Jordan, of course, you've got a kind of East Jordanian elite that holds power over a population that's mostly Palestinian and doesn't want more Palestinians. More broadly, they're also terrified of the Arab Spring, when the Arab street rose up, and there's nothing more guaranteed to, encourage the Arab street to rise up than the sight of Palestinians fighting for their land and territory and future, as they would see it. And Arab regimes have a kind of unspoken loathing of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Muslim Brotherhood are the party that rose up with the Arab Spring and challenged existing regimes. So I think in private, they whisper to the Israelis, keep going and destroy Hamas, but in public, they cannot be seen to encourage that. So can they come, the question is, can they come in after the war and pick up the pieces? They'll be very wary to do it. They will not want to be seen as the party that, has to chase after Hamas through the rubble of Gaza and in the tunnels. But perhaps in the context of a broader movement towards a two-state solution, they might be willing to, legitimate, give blessing, perhaps contribute something. But it would be under a very narrow set of circumstances, I think, that will be hard to achieve. So what are they doing? They're, providing humanitarian aid. The Jordanians did an airdrop of medical supplies. The Egyptians are, helping facilitate trucks going through. But, nobody wants this problem on their territory.
In the back, I think. Meanwhile, I'm going to take President's privilege and ask a quick question. You mentioned Iran in the context of this. As a military man, it strikes me we've already gotten, America has, into a bit of a shooting war with Iran and its proxies in the early days of this. What do you see as Iran's course, and are they willing to up the ante against America or against other players?
I think there's what people in Lebanon used to call sending messages with missiles and rockets and artillery. And the message is, don't get involved. And we have the power to make your life hell. And the Iranians, I think, are happy to draw the benefit, draw the attention in a program that war in Gaza is bringing upon Israel and upon the United States, reducing the credit and legitimacy that they have, but not wanting to get directly involved in a war that might cause severe damage to Lebanon, as it did in 2006, and weaken Hezbollah's position within that country, and also risk a shooting war between America and Iran directly. So Iran is using its proxies. So I think of Iran and its militias as a kind of sort of vulture, a parasite organization. They have great power by being the most organized force within broken societies and broken states. So Hezbollah within Lebanon and Iran within a fragmented and dysfunctional Middle East. So it can support the Houthis, it can support Shia militias, it can support Hezbollah, and it can even provide help to Hamas, and play the long game and gain points. And Hassan Nasrallah, in his first speech after October 7th, I think, spoke the truth when he says, for us, this is a points victory, not a knockout. So they're willing in certain circumstances to have the big fight, but they'd rather not. And I think they're happy to draw the benefit as things stand. But it's an extremely dangerous moment with plenty of opportunity for miscalculation. If Americans get killed, if a lot of Israelis get killed, then that could lead to massive escalation. Hassan Nasrallah, remember, the war in 2006 began with the Hezbollah kidnapping a small number of Israeli soldiers on the border. And later on, Nasrallah said, if I'd known this is what the impact would be, I would never have done it. Nevertheless, Hezbollah's back, they've reconstituted, and I think they're being held in reserve by Iran as a deterrent should America and Israel ever have a go at Iran's growing nuclear capability.
Thank you. In the back?
Yes, to what extent is Hamas monolithic? And is there meaningful distinction still to be drawn between the political wing and the military wing of Hamas? Is it possible that Hamas itself might splinter under unrelenting Israeli pressure? And then finally, to what extent does the population of Gaza support Hamas, genuinely support Hamas? And is there a possibility that Hamas having brought such disaster to the people of Gaza that there is a plausible possibility of an uprising of the people against Hamas?
So, I mean, Hamas, for all its religious talk, is a human organization with human frailties and human divisions within it. Nevertheless, I think it has a consistent ideology. So I should add one more thing. There was a time when Islamist groups were seen to be the moderates. Israeli military officials spoke to all the people who are now leaders of Hamas when they were pious, bearded engineers and doctors who were the opponents of nationalist Palestinian groups, and particularly left-wing Palestinian groups. So they were being encouraged as an alternative voice, and regimes around the Arab world were also supporting the Muslim Brothers as the counterbalance to these dangerous radical nationalists. A lot has changed, and I think Hamas is now in the world of being the spoilers. They sought out to destroy the Oslo Accords without leaving too many fingerprints, and I think they sought out to destroy the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel without leaving too many fingerprints, and will continue to do the same as there are attempts to make peace. Can it change? Well, I mean, the PLO came under relentless pressure from Israel, from Jordan, from Israel again during the war in Lebanon in '82, was expelled from Beirut, went into exile to Tunis, and came back as a partner for peace for the Israelis under the Oslo Accords. So, that is, in theory, a positive change. But there is also the negative change that can happen. When Israel destroyed the PLO in Lebanon and ended up with Hezbollah, who blew up the American embassy, well, the proto-Hezbollah, who blew up the American embassy, blew up the Marine barracks, blew up the French and the Israelis. And when the Israelis tried to kill a former leader of Hezbollah, who's Abbas Musawi, they ended up with Hassan Nasrallah, who was a much more capable leader. So they've ended up with Hezbollah, which is a much more powerful, organized, deadly organization than they had before. So it can swing both ways. Relentless pressure can give you better results, or it can give you a worse one. Hard to tell.
Jeremy?
Question, which is, where does the population of Gaza fit in? Well, I think they're, mostly hapless victims. Hamas did win the Palestinian election of 2007, and the Fatah did not let them take power, which was, when you go back into the history, was a radicalizing force, pushed Hamas to stage a coup in Gaza and expel Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. The current opinion polls suggest it does not have majority support, at least on the eve of October 7th. The question is, whom will Palestinians blame for the disaster? Will they blame Israel or will they blame Hamas? And I think it will be hard to tell. One thing that's interesting is that in Arab media, particularly the Saudi and the Egyptian media, you're starting to hear interviewers ask really hard questions of Hamas spokesmen, obviously in a kind of Arab perspective, which is, if you had all the cement and concrete, why did you build tunnels for yourselves and not build bomb shelters for Gazans? And the interesting reply from Musa Abu Marzouk is, well, the security of the Palestinian population is with the UN because they're refugees. The UN should have protected them, and whereas we were entitled to keep building tunnels for ourselves. I think that will go down badly, but whether that can translate into an actual political movement that removes power from Hamas, who knows?
Jeremy, question from
Yes.
your audience?
We have several from the online audience. The first is Martin Chawat asks, what would have to happen for the Palestinian Authority to be viewed as an authentic representative or government of the Palestinian people? And I might add, at the recent World Affairs Council conference in DC, I attended the Middle East Institute breakout session, and the former negotiator for the Palestinian Authority was really beside himself over the loss of the moderate position, the destruction of the center place, and of course those Palestinian thinking academics were coming from the perspective of the carpet bombing of Palestinian people. So they were complaining from that perspective, not unreasonably. So what would it take for the Palestinian Authority to come back and succeed?
I think coming back on the back of an Israeli tank is probably a bad way for them to do it. What do they need? Well, it would really help if they had new leadership. Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas is in the, what is it, the 15th year of a 4-year term, and has not held elections since 2007. And that's a real problem. The Palestinian Authority is corrupt. The Palestinian Authority is seen to be complicit or complacent in Israel's operations and raids in the West Bank. And I think above all, is seen to have failed to deliver Palestinian statehood. Therefore, it doesn't have much going for it. And it is kind of weak and ineffective. A lot of Palestinians, and I've often sympathized with this view, have felt the Palestinian Authority should have dismantled itself a long time ago and kind of give the plate back to the Israelis and say, here you go, you want to remain the occupying power, then remain the occupying power. And you run the hospitals and the roads and all the rest of it, and take responsibility. At the moment, the Israelis have, through this kind of stillborn Oslo process, drawn some kind of benefit until recently, which is to hive off the whole of the population of the Gaza Strip and saying we're no longer responsible for it, although they control the borders and the airspace and the internet and all the water and all the rest of it. And then in the West Bank, retain this patchwork of areas where the Palestinians again remain in charge of the main population centers, whereas Israelis keep the bits that they like, which is the high ground, the settlements, the aquifers, and the Jordan Valley. I think that model is falling apart. And can't make much more progress. So I think the word that Antony Blinken uses and Joe Biden uses, which is a revitalized Palestinian Authority, is important. I just don't see how you revitalize it. It'll involve some kind of new leadership, probably some kind of elections, perhaps recognition of Palestinian statehood with some kind of reconfiguration of the Palestinian Authority, kind of recognize the Palestinian state, although you don't recognize its actual borders, and so on and so forth. That would be a kind of hybrid thing, but there are kind of precedents for this. Germany was a state without having control of its borders. Cyprus is a state without having control of its full territory. So you might think in those terms. At the very least, I think the administration should do the one thing it said it would do, but hasn't yet done, which is to open a consulate in Jerusalem that can better negotiate and liaise with the Palestinians. In fact, my view was when Donald Trump decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, I thought, don't open just one embassy, open two. open an embassy to the Palestinians. And then you've performed your performative act of moving to Jerusalem, which reflects the reality of where the Israeli government sits, but also maintain some balance and maintain some dialogue with the Palestinian Authority. But a moderate voice, nationalist voice that says there is a border that we will be satisfied with, I think is hugely important to resolving this question peacefully.
Thank you.
Okay.
So back to your Iranian question and thoughts. Where are they getting their money, their external money? Is it Chinese oil contracts, or is it American and Western money that is regrettably and delayed given to them? I'm thinking of the Obama administration. I believe the figure was 150 billion. So where do the Iranians, other than their oil and gas, where are they getting the principal amounts of external funds? Thank you.
It's everything from oil to pistachios. By way of possibly drug money as well, particularly its offshoots in Syria and in Lebanon. Look, I mean, oil is a global commodity. It's fungible, and the world has a huge appetite for oil. Where there's oil, the producers will find a way of getting it out. You've seen with Russia that it's been able to get most of its oil out, perhaps at a discount, perhaps through a roundabout route that's a bit more costly, but they can get their oil out. Same thing with the Iranians, who've been moving crude around. It's also, because it's a big country with lots of borders and lots of neighbors, so it's very hard to seal hermetically. And the power of the dollar is substantial, but it's not omnipresent and all powerful. So I think there's a kind of inevitability about it. People on the right in America say, well, if only we tried maximum pressure even harder, it might have worked. But I think ultimately Iran's ability to meddle in the Middle East is not hugely expensive, and its proxies have other means of earning money, as well as the money that Iran sends. I think what Iran sends is organization ability, thinking, tactics. What's worked here might work there. Missile technology, how to make rockets, as kind of organizing principle. And by the way, I think the United States ought to be doing a lot more of this kind of indirect action, which is why Ukraine was a prime example of it, which is why it's so distressing to see the will to persevere with it fade away. So yes, can more be done to squeeze Iran? No doubt, yes. Will that bring about the revolution in Iran that will topple the mullahs? Who knows? Probably not. Although the mullahs are unpopular, but they haven't yet been forced out. It's very hard to make sanctions work as a tool of regime change. Will squeezing Iran stop it causing trouble elsewhere? It may reduce its capacity to cause trouble by reducing money somewhat, but only somewhat. But it may increase its will and desire to cause trouble in order to break out of the straitjacket. So it's not an easy answer, in my view.
Anton, walk us through, or if you can, the Israeli internal political situation and what's next there. Right now we have Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu with this kind of coalition government, this wartime government, trying to show solidarity, unity in the face of a threat. But that doesn't last. When does that end? What's next?
Conventionally, you would assume that Israelis would rally around the flag and that would rally around a government of unity at a time of intense crisis. But 3/4 of Israelis seem to want Netanyahu gone. And he may not last very long. He may last through the war, and he may not last, probably won't last the reckoning that comes after. Nevertheless, Netanyahu has been written off before, and he's come back. He's a great comeback kid, the magician, as his devotees call him. Number two, the opposition is divided. Benny Gantz has joined the war cabinet, not the cabinet as a whole, but the war cabinet, and the other opposition party has remained in opposition because Netanyahu has retained his far-right allies because he knows he will need them in future. So he navigates between trying to sound sensible in the war cabinet in his dealings with Americans, and then to the right, he says, I'm the only one who can stop the creation of a Palestinian state. So he's still playing politics. Whereas the heads of the military and intelligence have said, yes, we bear responsibility for failing to see October 7th happen. Netanyahu has A, not said that, B, tried to blame security heads for misleading him. So, I think a lot is still to play for. Some of this depends on how hard the Americans press him. I don't, do the Americans mean what they say when they say we have to go towards a two-state solution? And if they mean what they say, do they have the ability to push for it? And if they do push for it, can Netanyahu survive? My sense is if the Americans really want it and are really serious and want to do it in short term, then that's an additional pressure that could easily force Netanyahu out.
Thank you. Jeremy, question on your end?
Yes, John O'Connor writes, isn't the challenge for a post-conflict Gaza rather that if rebuilt, it would be destroyed in a future conflict? The fear that rather than rebuilding Gaza to be economically viable, it will continue to be a base for attacks, and therefore the destruction becomes a necessity for Israel's security. I guess that's the don't mow the lawn, level it effectively.
I hesitate to go down, pursue this metaphor much further. But yes, the mow the lawn or kind of, put herbicide on it and turn it over. Look, I mean, there's still a Palestinian population there that's dispossessed and aggrieved and increasingly so and impoverished and has nothing to lose. So that's, the other danger is that you have a permanent ungoverned state from which more evils emerge, as they did from Somalia and the Sahel and Afghanistan. So yes, I agree that Israel will find that Israel is in a position where it has not done enough damage to Gaza to destroy Hamas, and it's probably already done too much damage to go much further and retain international support. So, what does it do? And if it goes much further, it can't get out for the reasons that the questioner raised and for many more. So I suspect that, one of two things will happen. The Americans will say enough is enough, and you've done enough to restore deterrence. So we go back to the old mowing the lawn problem. So, and how long it'll be before they have to go back in, who knows? Or they become a kind of permanent occupation, a semi-occupation with the Gaza Strip, with Israelis in control of northern Gaza, Gaza partitioned down the middle, and some kind of thing surviving in the south with Israelis conducting periodic raids and the UN and others trying to bring humanitarian aid as best they can. And then who knows what emerges. And then probably you wait until after the American election or after the Israeli election and somebody has a better idea.
Is there another question in the room? Jeremy, why don't we give you the last question with your group?
Okay, I have another one from David Eastis, who asks, what would a two-state solution look like geographically?
That's an easy question. Go ahead.
You know, geographically, it goes back to something similar to what was being discussed in Oslo, which nobody was very happy with, but may have been everyone's second or third best option. And the problem comes down to the distribution of population. So the easy bit is that Israel doesn't really want Gaza back unless you're a headbanger settler who dreams of reestablishing the settlements of Gush Katif in Gaza. Then most Israelis probably don't want to have to rule Palestinian cities. That's Area A under Oslo. And then they do want to keep, the settlements, the settlement blocks where 80% of the settler population lives. And they want to keep some form of presence in the Jordan Valley because of its importance to security. And then you need some contiguity of the Palestinian state. And then you need something in Jerusalem, because what's a Palestinian state without Jerusalem? So some kind of shared agreement. And then you can really go crazy and talk about the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and whether you have a functional division, you have a vertical division along the first line of the stones of the Herodian wall, or you have a horizontal division that runs under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then you can really go mad. So anyway, elements of all those things have to be part of it. Security is obviously a huge part of it. So it doesn't look very different from what Oslo looked like. I just think it's very hard to get there. And I also think that you probably need something much broader involving the region, perhaps some kind of confederal arrangement with Jordan so that the Palestinians feel reattached to their brethren in Jordan, and Israel feels that there are grown-ups involved, that they trust states like Jordan and Egypt, which have long-term peace agreements with Israel, much more than they do the Palestinian Authority or whatever thing emerges from Gaza. So, I think a mixture of sort of internal, statehood for the Palestinians and external, an external web of some kind, with a lot of American guarantees to hold it together. But as I say, I think this is really, really hard in this year, this decade, probably. Hope I'm wrong.
Well, thank you, Anton. I do have one more question completely off this subject. There's been a question asked whether there's any relation between you and Fiorello LaGuardia, who was also a member of the predecessor of the U.S. Air Force before he became mayor.
Sadly not. I've taken a picture of myself next to the statue of Fiorello in New York to send to friends and family, but there is no connection, except that, of course, the name comes from Italy. So I was born in Rome. His family was Italian, at least in part. So I'll lay that claim to his.
Well, thank you, Anton. I think, ladies and gentlemen, you agree we couldn't have had a better speaker on a more timely subject.
Well, thank you for your time, your attention. I'm sorry I wasn't there. Would have glad to have had drinks with everybody and to continue chatting in private. But I hope I can make it down sometime soon. You've been a great audience. Thank you.
Well, we'll look forward to having you here in person and taking you around and being able to talk to you more. Thank you again, Anton. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Really appreciate the turnout tonight. Great group, great questions. Please stay tuned. We'll be getting back to you with more program suggestions. Be safe. Happy holidays. Thank you, Mark.